What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. So today's video, we are going to be doing timing chain and guide replacement on my Mini Cooper S. This is a 2007 Mini Cooper S R56. I will show you guys the reason why we're doing timing chain in my situation. I attempted to do a valve cover gasket or went to go do the valve cover earlier on and found some issues. I'll show you guys those issues when we get in there, and then I'll discuss, we'll go through the whole process of replacing this timing chain. I'm gonna show you guys how to do it. The repair instructions ask you to take a lot of things off that aren't really necessary to take off, so I'm gonna shortcut this and kind of show you guys the easier way to do it. So let's get to it. So the first thing we're going to do our timing chain replacement is we're going to get our battery disconnected because we're going to be messing around in the area down here with the alternator, and I don't want to risk bumping into anything, and or you don't want to run the risk of it attempting to start or do anything crazy. So we're going to get the battery unhooked. Normally there's a cover here. Mine is obviously broken off. We're going to get this replaced in the future, but there's two locking tabs normally built into this right here and right here that you pull back and lift this cover up to get into this battery. And then right here is going to be your negative battery cable. So it's a 10mm bolt holding that cable down. We are going to take that 10mm bolt off, and we are going to take our cable off, and we're going to throw it off to the side over here, make sure it's secured, that it's not going to jump back up in place and accidentally get connected back up. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to work on getting this front core support out, and then after we get this core support out, we're going to get our valve cover removed and start taking things off up top up here, and before we go down underneath the car. So let's get on to the next steps. All right, so the first things we're going to do to get this valve cover off is we're going to start taking all the stuff off that's attached to it. First thing we're going to work on getting off is going to be our ignition coils. Those are relatively easy. You just pull up on these connectors. These are actually a little messed up on this car, so normally they squeeze in here. When you pick the actual connector housing up, it actually pushes the plug connection out at the same time, and then once you get that out, you can grab these ignition coils and pick them up and set them off to the side. So we're going to get all the ignition coils pulled out of here. Sometimes they get a little bit stuck in there. Get all four of those ignition coils set off the side. Now this would be a good time if you think that it's needed or at that point in time, replace your ignition coils. Obviously, if you're not having issues with them, it's not really necessary, but it's something you can maybe take into consideration. So the next thing we're going to start doing is getting all of our wiring and stuff off of this. So we have an entire wire track here that holds a bunch of the actual coil wires in place. It has some locking tabs here along the bottom, so you're going to want to try to pry out on this cover here. You have to take the oxygen sensor wire out of the cover and pull it off to the side. And then again, same thing here. You're going to actually just pry out on this cover a little bit, and it'll unlock it from those locking tabs. You'll be able to pick it up. These are the locking tabs that I'm talking about, these little holes here. So I'm going to pry that off, get that out of the way. That leaves access to our ignition coil wiring. We're going to pull all these guys out of here to set them off to the side. There is a locking mechanism, or a locking, not locking mechanism, like a hold down guy here. This one, the zip tie's cut on, but normally it would just pop right off of there. You have an 8mm bolt right here holding that ground for the wiring harness down, so we're going to get that pulled off real quick. That's out of the way. We can pull our wiring harness out and just kind of pull it off to the side. Doesn't really need to get crazy out of the way, just needs to get out of the way. And then we have a wiring harness here for our boost pressure sensor that again is just kind of clipped into these little locking or hold in place tabs on the valve cover. You can either get in here with a pocket screwdriver or something like that and knock them loose, or pry them off with a pry tool like I'm using here. Pry them off to the side so they're not interfering. And then if you want to make your life easier, you can unplug this boost pressure sensor to kind of move the wiring up here and out of the way while you're doing things. Next thing we're going to do is we have a positive crankcase ventilation valve hose here. On the end of this valve cover right here, there is like a locking mechanism that you have to pry up on in order to get this hose to come out properly. You can just pull this hose out if you'd like to, but this little locking mechanism here actually holds that hose in place. So we got that out of the way. We can then pull this hose off of here, kind of bend it off to the side, get out of our way. On the end of the valve cover here, we have a camshaft position sensor. We're going to undo the plug connection for that. There's a tab on the end of it. You just pick up on the tab, push the connector towards the driver's side of the car, and you should be able to push that plug connection off. And then the only thing we have left to get off of this before we're taking the valve cover off is going to be this vent line over here as well. These vent lines have these like serrated areas on them where you're supposed to pinch, and when you do that, it spreads the top and bottom apart and actually allows you to get that connection off of there. Sometimes just with age, they don't tend to work the way they're supposed to. You might have to get like a pocket screwdriver or something like that in there. So again, this guy right here, these little serrated edges here, you're just going to squeeze it like this, and it should spread those things apart and allow you to take it off. So we've done everything out of the way. We are now ready to take our valve cover off. Our valve cover coming off is going to be, bring you guys in here real quick and show you, is going to be all of these 10mm screws around the outside edge holding the valve cover down. So we're going to pop those screws off and get our valve cover pulled off real quick. All right, so now that we got all of our bolts pulled out, we're going to pry up on our valve cover lightly with a screwdriver and pop it off. One thing I do want to point out to you guys is be aware that these two screws down here on the far end are longer than the rest of them. Just be aware when you're going to put it back together. It's going to be pretty difficult to put them back in the wrong spot because obviously they stick up really high and they're not going to fit right. And then this front one in the middle here is a special kind of screw as well. It has the stud on it that our wiring harness connected to. So now that we got all of our screws out, we're going to pry up on our valve cover. I believe I have all of my screws out. I do. There we go. Obviously, some of them will come off real easy. Other ones might be a little difficult like that. But we got all of our screws out. Pull up on it. And we're going to pick our valve cover straight up. And then just to keep stuff from falling out of it, you can flip it back over so that you don't have any oil dripping while you walk away from the car. Now at this point in time, if you were not replacing the valve cover, you would just end up replacing the gasket itself. This is the gaskets are on the perimeter of it. There's also two seals on each set of two spark plug tubes that you have to replace as well. Those come in the gasket set. Pull your gasket out of there, put your new one in. Make sure when you're putting it back together, or putting your new valve cover on, that you're applying some RTV silicone at the back corners of this block at the end. It's gonna be right down in here. I'm gonna be putting RTV right here where my finger is at, and then also on that side as well. The reason for that is because there's this piece right here is actually bolted down onto the cylinder head, and because there's a slight gap there where the rubber gasket can't seal, you want to make sure that you put some RTV in there to kind of fill that gap in so you don't have any issues. All right, so we got our valve cover off. That's kind of step one. You can kind of pick and choose where you want to start off with. Obviously, we did our batteries first. So you can take your valve cover off, or you can move on to this step that we're about to do first. It doesn't really matter the order up here. Just this is stuff that's got to come off. So the next thing we're going to do is, normally the repair instructions want you to take the whole front of this car off, like taking wheel well trims out, the actual like plastic trim on each wheel well on either side, the actual felt liner inside, all that stuff, and taking the whole front of the car apart, because they have a special bracket that they want you to install on the alternator down here that kind of mounts the engine to the body in place of the engine mount here to support it while you're doing the job. Now, if you want to go through doing it that way, by all means do that, but it's not really necessary. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get this top support piece off here, this guy here that runs all the way around, so I can get to the engine mount and take the engine mount off. And in order to take that engine mount off, we'll end up supporting our engine from underneath on the oil pan with a jack and a block of wood. Makes life a lot easier, don't have to take as much stuff off. So in order to get this front core support piece off to get to our engine mount, we're going to have to take this front grill piece off here, okay? Normally there's a bunch of clips or push pins in here that hold this guy in place into the front of the car. My car does not have any of them. That's how I received it, so it makes my life a little easier, but it just has a bunch of clips that hold it in here and normally just pulls right off the front of the car. Okay, mine's pretty loose. A lot of the clips are broken. After you get this off, we're going to work on getting our headlights out. Those are 10mm bolts there. There's one down here, and then there's one right there as well, and that's the same on the other side. And then once you get the bolts out, there's a plug connection here. This locking tab right here is press-in style. You're going to press both of these tabs in, pull the plug connection off. That applies for the same on the other side. So I'm going to get the headlights out and get this grill out, and then we'll move on to the next steps for getting this actual upper radiator support guy out of there. All right, so we got our headlights and our grill out. I did want to show you guys how these locking tabs on the back of this grill work. So these little guys, you can kind of see how there's like a kicked out part. That kicked out part's the part that locks into the actual front bumper. In order to get this guy out, you're just going to reach in behind the grill and squeeze this guy in like this on the back side, because this is the part that you can actually see push through the hole in the bumper. And you're going to squeeze this together and it'll unlock this locking tab and let this grill pop out of the way for you. So set that off to the side. Next, we're going to work on getting this guy out of the way. So in order to get this out, got to get the coolant reservoir out. There's normally an 8mm bolt in there. I already pulled that out. You got to get this little push pin guy out here. This pries up to get your washer fluid reservoir detached from there. You're going to have to undo the hood latch cable stuff, which is going to be popping this cover open on this. And then there's a little lock mechanism in there, or like a cable style, kind of like a brake cable on a bike. You have to pull that stuff apart to disconnect this half that goes into the car from this half that goes to the two latches. Once you get that removed, you got two 13s here, two 13s there, a bunch of 10s here along the top that are holding the charge pipe in. This guy's holding this upper support into this guy over here. And then along the front, I'm not 100% sure that there's anything else left that's got to come off. If I encounter anything crazy, I'll come back and I'll show you guys. But I'm going to get all the rest of this stuff off and get this upper radiator support off. All right, so we got our front upper radiator support off. The only thing I did forget to tell you guys is in the top of the radiator support, in these two holes right here on either side of the hood latch, is two T30 screws that go into here and here on the hood latch, kind of hold the hood latch in place. You got to take those off in order to take it off. And then once you get this mechanism over here taken apart, you can get the actual core support pulled away from the hood latch cable coming from inside the car here and set it off to the side. It actually won't go through this hole without taking the cables. Technically have to go out the other way, so because of that I don't feel like taking them off the hood latches and stuff here. So you can just take your support and kind of lay it off to the side over here. Just make sure you protect your car with something so that it doesn't scratch the paint or the plastic trim on the side. So we got that off now. The next thing I'm going to work on getting off is this charge tube. There's a clip back here on the back side. You can see it right there. That kind of sticks out. Pry that tab out towards the strut tower here, and this hose should pull out of the intake down there, and then follow this hose back down here. Obviously it's not attached anymore because it was attached right here to the core support. Follow it back down to the bottom, and if you look down here, you have your air intake tube here that follows down. You can either take off this worm gear clamp right here and take the plastic tube out of the rubber hose down there, or there's also another clamp down here right at the end of my finger down towards the bottom that you'll be able to see from looking up top. That clamp is facing towards the ground right now. That's where it goes on at the intercooler. I'm probably going to take it off there just because it'll be easier to get it off apart and back together down there versus in the middle here. I'm going to experiment though, and I'll let you guys know what works out best for me, but I'm going to get this hose out of there. And then once we get that hose out of there, we have clear access to our engine mount, and then we'll get our engine supported up underneath, and we'll get our engine mount pulled out of the way. All right, so I got my charge tube out of there. I ended up taking the whole thing off all the way down to the actual intercooler there at that end. This is the part that goes in the back. Just loosen that worm gear clamp on that end, pop that clip out. My screw right here in the middle was missing, so I want to say it was probably going to be a T25 or a T30 holding that piece in, but I didn't have mine, so I don't really know what to tell you guys. Got our hose out of the way, have access to our upper engine mount. Now that we have our intake tube out of the way, you can kind of see the reason why in my situation I'm replacing the timing chain guide is if you look right here, this piece of metal here should have plastic over top of it here on this end, and plastic holding that tension or that chain down on that end. So I went to go do a valve cover gasket in the past due to the fact that my valve cover gasket was leaking, and found that this was missing, okay? So that's why I'm doing my timing chain. So if you're doing work on one of these, valve cover is pretty easy to take off. Just pop it off and do an inspection of the timing chain guide up here, as well as the stuff down in here, to make sure that you don't have anything broken. I didn't notice anything broken in there at the time, so I've let this go for about a month or so with this piece missing off of here. Just getting parts ordered, things like that. Haven't really driven the car a whole lot, so I wasn't really super concerned about it. But this is why we're doing timing chains on this, because 147,000 miles, this is what ends up happening. So getting that timing chain off, we're going to move on to that part now. We have to get this engine mount out of the way. Before you take that engine mount out of the way, make sure that you are supporting your oil pan with a block of wood, or a jack and a block of wood. I recommend the block of wood just to kind of disperse the weight of the engine over the whole width of the oil pan, instead of just on the small part of the jack that you would normally jack up the vehicle on, because you can potentially dent and or damage the oil pan. So make sure you're using like a 2x4 or a 4x4 like I have. So once you get the engine supported, you know it's not going to fall out the bottom of the car on this side. You're going to then work on getting this mount out. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4 13mm bolts holding this upper mount onto the engine, and then you have a 18mm nut here that takes this upper bolt out, and also make sure that you're taking off this 13mm nut here for this ground strap and getting it out of the way. And once you get that out, we're going to get our actual engine mount itself out of the way, and that is going to be a 13 here on this side, and there's a 13 down on the other side over here. I don't know if you guys are going to be able to see it where I'm at. It's down underneath here. And then after you get those two out, there is a 16, what I believe is a 16mm bolt. I'll correct myself here in the video if I'm wrong, that unbolts the engine mount itself from the body of the car, and then we'll get that out of the way so we can get access to the front of the car, front of the engine, so we can start taking the timing chain stuff apart. So let's get this engine mount off. All right, we've got our engine mount support bracket and engine mount itself out of the way. You can see there's a bunch of crap underneath our engine mount. I'll clear this out before I'm done. But next we got to get this guy off. This is like the actual like adapter bracket, I guess, whatever you want to call it, that allows those screws to go down through that engine mount arm or crossover brace. So there's 4 E12s. There's 1, 2, 3, and then 4 down here. Got to take those 4 E12s out and get this bracket out of the way in order to get access to some of our screws. It's actually these guys right here that hold our timing insert in place. But we're going to get this bracket out of the way, just working on getting some more stuff out of the way so we can get to what we have to do. And then next I'm going to work on getting the drive bolt off, but let me get this bracket off real quick. All right, so we got our engine support arm out of the way. This guy bolts in here like this. One thing that I did want to point out that I forgot to mention, because I didn't even know / forgot, right here and right here is 2 2mm bolts that are holding this wiring harness to that bracket. So make sure you undo those bolts before you pull this bracket out. So the next thing we're going to work on is getting our belt off and our belt tensioner, or belt detension, and then our belt off. It's kind of a 2-step process on this car because of the way things are designed. So in order to take tension off of the belt, you put a 21mm wrench, has to be 12 point. I don't know that a 6-point wrench will really work on here. I've never tried because I've always had 12-point wrenches, but you're putting it on this guy, and then you're going to pull this tensioner towards you if you're standing in front of the car, or pull it towards the front of the car, and that will pull the tensioner up off the belt. And then once there's no tension on the belt, or once you've got it up far enough, this little guy right here, this little spring-loaded mechanism that I'm pushing on right here, actually locks in the top half of this arm, and it holds the tension off of the tensioner, or holds the tension off the belt. So you're going to pull back on this 21mm wrench and push this little guy in until it locks in place, and then let go of the wrench, and it should hold the tension or detention. So I'm going to get that off, and then we're going to go move on to our next step, which is going to require going down into the wheel well to get the other tensioner off. I'll explain that here in a second so that we can get our drive bolt off the rest of the way. All right, so we got our tensioner detensioned up top to get the tension off of our belt, but we have another component to this that's got to be taken loose in order to get the belt off. So in order to do that, you're going to have to take the passenger front tire off. From this point on, this tire's got to stay off because we're going to be doing a lot of work in this area. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to take this wheel well liner off. There's a bunch of little plastic push pins in here that are holding this in place, as well as some, I believe, are T45 screws. I'll correct myself here in the video if I'm wrong on that. And then this whole felt wheel well liner should pull out of the way. There might be some more underneath here. I'll look and I'll note that when we go to, once we get it off, I'll let you guys know if I found anything right there. But I'm gonna get this wheel well liner off, and I'm gonna show you the next part that we have to get tension off of in order to get the drive belt off. All right, so I got our wheel well liner completely out of the way. It was a little bit more of a pain than I thought it was going to be. The bolts that are holding it in, the actual bolts, are T30s, not T40s. And then underneath here, there's a 10mm nut on a stud. And then underneath your mud flap / side skirt, there's another push pin that's holding this part of this liner in right here at the back side. So a little difficult. Obviously it's not hard plastic, it's soft, so it makes it a little bit easier to get out. But now that we got it apart, we're going to get the rest of the stuff off in order to detension our belt and pull our belt out. And then after we pull our belt out, we'll be taking our harmonic balancer pulley off, or our crankshaft pulley off. So the thing that we have to take tension off of is actually this interesting little guy right here. It's what Mini calls a friction wheel. So what it is doing, because there wasn't enough room to like route the drive belt for the water pump itself, this guy back here is actually the water pump pulley, one that you can see up in there. Because there wasn't enough room to run a drive belt back there, they ran this little friction wheel that runs off the back side of the drive belt, and that in turn then spins the water pump pulley. And the water pump pulley itself has like rubber on it so that it frictions and is able to spin it. This tensioner guy right here is got tension pulling it up into place between these two pulleys here. So in order to remove that tension from that friction wheel, you have to grab this little pull tab right. Let me see if I can get a flashlight in here so you guys can see. This little pull tab right here. You have to pull on that. When you pull on that, it actually pulls the friction wheel away from the two pulleys, as you can see. See how it's moving my friction wheel? Now, when you do that, once you pull that out, if you look up in there, there's actually like a slot in that little metal tab that thing's made out of, or this little pull guy is made out of. You have to stick something in that slot, normally like a pocket screwdriver or a pick or something like that, in order to hold it out. Otherwise, it just goes back in. So I'm going to pull this out and get a pick put in there to hold it away from everything so that it's not holding tension on things. And then once we do that, we can then come back up here and work from up here / underneath and take out the 3 10mm nuts or bolts that are holding that friction wheel in place so we can get it out of the way. So I'm going to get it untensioned, get it taken out, and I'll show you guys what it looks like removed from the car. All right, so we got our friction wheel out. You can kind of see the actual water pump pulley up there to the left. It's just got a rubber coating on the back side or the outside edge of the pulley, and the drive belt drives this little belt tension that we took off, or friction wheel, and then that in turn spins the water pump pulley. So we got our belt taken off the rest of the way. This is our little tension guy. This guy right here rides on the back side of the drive belt, and then the other side of it over here spins on that friction wheel or that rubber disc on the water pump and spins the water pump. Just interesting design, kind of cool stuff. They didn't have room to run a regular drive belt system, so this is what they came up with. It does say in their repair instructions that some of these cars, this can be like a variable, like actuated tensioner, which I guess means that it can like disable it on some vehicles for, I don't know, probably faster warm up so the water pump's not moving coolant immediately. This car doesn't have one, but it does caution you when you're doing the repair to make sure that you unplug the plug connection for this beforehand if it is that style. So just pay attention to what you're taking apart in there. So we got our friction wheel out of the way. We can take our harmonic balancer out. It has 3 E10 bolts in it. I'm going to use a 3/8 inch impact gun in order to pop those out. And then the other thing we got to get off, because it's in the way of things, is our water pump pulley. That has 3 10mm bolts holding it on. You can kind of see the bolts up in there. Is it 3 or 4? It might be 4. Don't quote me on that. No, it looks like it's 3. So take the water pump pulley off. You're going to have to hold the outside edge of this pulley with something. The repair instructions recommend using like a strap wrench or something like that. The other thing you can do is you can actually break these bolts loose before taking the tensioner guy out, so that they're already broken loose. And then once you get the tensioner out, you just got to undo them by hand. I'll get them popped out of there though. So I'm going to get this water pump pulley off, and I'm going to get this harmonic balancer off, and then we're going to move on to the next step of our process, which is getting our engine set up in time in order to be able to take the timing chain stuff apart. All right, so one more thing I forgot to take off in the beginning, but you can do it at any point in stage up to where we're at. I had to take the air box out. That includes unhooking our fresh air inlet pipe and undoing the screw clamp connection for our mass airflow sensor and unplugging our mass airflow sensor. And then once you get the air box off and set off to the side, we're also going to take our charge pipe that comes off of our throttle body down here and kind of like elbows up to this area up here out of the way, because we need to get access to this chain tensioner bolt that's back here. So that whole intake system that I took off with this, the active noise tube and all that stuff, is just a bunch of worm gear clamps and flat blade. You can either use flat blade screwdriver or 1/4 inch socket in order to get those off, depending on where they're oriented and so on and so forth. So I got that out of the way. We're at the point now where we're ready to start doing our timing, set our engine up for timing. The first thing we're going to do, though, in order to know, because we have to put our engine at top dead center on cylinder number 1, is I'm going to pull the spark plugs out. In order to do that, this engine's kind of crazy, requires a specialty socket. This is a 12.42mm socket. You can find these on Amazon. That's where I purchased this one from. This is actually like a long extension style one, so you can get down in here and clear your valve cover and everything like that when you're doing spark plugs. I will put a link in the description to this spark plug socket, just so you guys can have it to use on this car for now and in the future. You're also going to need timing tools at this point in order to do that. I'll also put a link in the description of this video for the timing tools, and so that you can do this job. So I'm going to pull the spark plugs out, get the longer flat blade screwdriver down in here so we can know when cylinder 1 is at top dead center. And I'm going to rotate this engine over and get it timed at top dead center and get our pin put in, and I'm going to show you guys where to put that pin in underneath the car. So let me get the spark plugs out and get it kind of close to top dead center, and I'll show you the rest of that process. All right, so I pulled all my spark plugs out. I really only need to pull cylinder 1 out, but I pull the rest of them out because it makes the engine a lot easier to turn over when there's no spark plugs fighting compression. Your compression gas can just push out the spark plug hole. So now that I've got it, all the spark plugs out, I've got a screwdriver in here that's sitting on top of the piston. I'm going to turn this motor over, and what I'm looking for is on both of these camshafts, right here on the camshaft there's the word EX, and then on this one it's going to be a little bit difficult to read just because of how varnished it is, but there's going to be an IN for intake. These numberings, or this numbering in the EX for exhaust, has to be facing up in order for the engine to be in top dead center at cylinder 1. And then we can also turn our crankshaft over down here and see that our piston is currently moving up to the top. You can see that our screwdriver is moving up. Okay, so once we've got it in that position and we're close to top dead center, you're going to go underneath the car with your timing tool that goes in the end of the transmission. It goes up in place here, goes into that hole right here. It's this guy right here. Okay, you're going to push it into the hole until it touches the flywheel, and then you're going to turn the engine over at the crankshaft with your ratchet on the other end until that tool falls into the hole in the flywheel that is top dead center. Now, what's going to fall into the hole, this is another tool that's in this kit, is this smaller part of this pin. So that pin that's in there has a smaller like drop down area on it. That's what's going to fall into the hole inside of there. So when that falls into the hole inside of the flywheel, you've locked the crankshaft in time, and then after we get the crankshaft locked in time, we're going to move on to putting our tools that lock our camshafts in place, and then we'll get our timing chain untensioned and everything taken apart the rest of the way. So I'm going to get this locked into time. I'll show you guys what it should look like trying to turn it at the crankshaft when it's locked, and then we'll move on to getting our timing tools put on the top half of the motor. All right, so we got our engine at top dead center, cylinder 1 compression, our screwdriver is up as high as it'll go. We have our tool locked in the crankshaft, and the way you know that it's locked in there properly is you cannot turn the crankshaft by the ratchet either direction. So I'm pushing down right now, engine doesn't turn over. I'm pulling up towards me, engine doesn't turn over. That lets you know that it's locked in place and that the crankshaft is locked in time and you're not going to have any issues. Another way that you can know that everything is set up properly is, again, our EX on this camshaft and our IN, if you could see it, on that camshaft is facing up. And then you can also take your timing tools and then drop them down over top of your camshafts, and if they sit flush on the cylinder head and on this other boss over here on the other side, then you know that this camshaft is in time. At top dead center, everything's right. This one over here, it goes onto, but if you look, there's a little bit of a gap there. This is variable camshaft timing here, so this camshaft might be a little bit leaned that direction in order to just because of where it stopped when I shut the engine off. So what you can do to make sure that that's in the right position and locked in place properly and flat is you can actually turn this at this center bolt, and it'll actually turn the camshaft itself inside of the adjustment unit and lock it down into its end stop positions where these tools go on properly. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to get my tools locked into place, and we're going to work on getting our timing chain stuff off. And once we get it off, I'll walk you through the pulling it apart process and then putting it back in, making sure it's all in time properly again. And then this will just be a reversal of everything you've done already and putting it back together. So let me get this all set up, and we'll work on getting our timing chain taken apart. All right, so as you saw before, everything was at top dead center. We made sure that our crank pin locked in place so our crankshaft doesn't turn anymore. I now have both of the timing tools on the intake and exhaust camshaft. The exhaust side bolts down to the head here, and then this little bracket here holds the inside part of the exhaust tool in place. And then the intake camshaft tool bolts to the cylinder head over here, and then bolts to the exhaust cam tool. So this is all locked in top dead center. We know that our crank pin is locked into our flywheel at top dead center, so our engine is in a position now where we can start taking the timing stuff apart, and it will stay in position. So when we put everything back together, it'll still be in time properly. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get the exhaust or the intake and exhaust cam gears removed, as well as we need to loosen the crankshaft bolt down there so that we can pull the retaining piece out that is in there that locks into the timing chain gear itself at the bottom. So these are E12s up here. The crankshaft bolt is an 18 millimeter. When you're doing the bolt down the crankshaft bolt, you are supposed to have a counterhold tool. I will put a picture up right now of what that's supposed to look like as far as the special tool goes. I don't have that special tool. I actually have a tool that a friend of mine modified. This is actually like a fan clutch wrench that he drilled 2 holes in, and what he did was drilled 2 holes in it, and they are in place of the crankshaft, harmonic balancer bolt, so that it can hold the crankshaft in place while you try to loosen this bolt in the middle. So these 2 bolts were bolts that were holding the harmonic balancer on. We now have them bolted through this tool here so we can counter hold our crankshaft while we try to break this bolt loose. This bolt has a lot of torque on it. It's actually, I believe, like 150 or 160 foot-pounds, and then like 200 some odd degrees of rotation in order to tighten this down. So it's going to be rather difficult to get this off. So that's why we have this tool to hold it in place. I also, along with this tool, you have your crank pin in place, and you also have your cam gears locked. It's all kind of resistance to allow us to break that camshaft bolt loose. So I'm going to get that broken loose, and we'll get these cam gears pulled off. And once we get all that stuff pulled apart, we'll be able to pull our whole timing cassette up, and I'll show you guys how to do that. All right, so we got our crankshaft bolt broken loose. Again, like I said, there's a lot of torque on that, so we're probably going to need a little bit of help from someone to hold that other half of that tool while you're trying to break it loose with a 3/8 ratchet. I have a I think a 2 foot long ratchet, 2.5 foot long ratchet that I use. I was able to do it by myself with these 2, but you might want to have some help holding that. It's not necessary, but it makes life easier. The next thing we took off was on the back of the engine back here, right in this area, right next to this camshaft adjustment solenoid, is the timing chain tensioner. That is a 27 millimeter head on that, and then you should unscrew it and it'll release the tension off of this actual plunger that holds your tension on your timing chain. So now that we have that out, this stuff's all detensioned, our crankshaft bolt's loose. We have to break both of our intake and exhaust camshaft bolts loose. Remember, those are E12s. And the other thing that we have to get off are the bolts that hold the actual timing chain guide set up in place inside the engine. So right here is a T40, I believe. T45. T45. Okay, that pin goes through right here and holds this exhaust side of this timing chain guide, and then underneath you can see from up underneath here, there's one right here and one right here. Those hold the lower half of the guide in place. So you're going to get the one up top and the two down here out, and then you're going to take this central bolt out and pull this guy out, this whole like hub here that the harmonic balancer bolted to. You're going to pull that out, and that's going to allow the whole timing chain cassette to pull out the top. The only other thing that I have left to take off, and you can take it off earlier than this, but I'm going to do it right now, is this actual support here between the two camshafts, just that holds tension on the chain when it runs between the two of them. So that is two 8mm bolts right down there. So get that out, get the 3 T45 guide pins out, get your intake and exhaust camshaft bolts broken loose, and you'll be able to pull the whole cassette out. So I'm going to get this all pulled out, and I'm going to show you guys what this looks like removed from the engine. Alright, so we got all our bolts pulled out, all our retaining guide pins pulled out, and then the last thing I had to take out was this hub that goes through the middle of the timing chain gears and stuff like that. This is what your harmonic balancer bolts to, and what that big center bolt that we were trying to break loose before was going through. I just threw one of the bolts back in it so I could have something to hold on to pull it out of the motor. Set that down here, and then what was supposed to happen is you're supposed to be able to grab the chain itself, now that the gears and everything are off, and pick up the whole timing chain cassette and pull it out as one unit, like this. Alright, it's supposed to come out like this. You're supposed to be able to grab the chain, pull it back up through. This is the, this is the way it should come out of the motor, just like this. Pull straight up, pull it all out. The gear itself is supposed to kind of pull up the timing chain cassette and pull it out as one. One thing that I do want to point out that I forgot to point out to you guys when you're going to pull that whole cassette out is the dipstick itself has to come out. Because the dipstick, this is interesting, I don't think I remember this being like this, but the dipstick actually runs through the timing chain cassette through that hole right there and down through, and then comes out the bottom down here. So you have to pull the dipstick tube out in order to do that. Now I say that it's supposed to come out like that in one piece like that because mine did not. My two halves of my cassette are broken. My pieces that hold the cassette together are broken. There was a piece of a chain guide here that was wedged down on the bottom that you can see has some like wear marks on it. And then one really interesting one is you can kind of tell that how long and how worn out this timing chain guide is on this front side. This is actually the side where the oil dipstick is going through in this area. You can kind of start to see this like nub that's worn out through where the chain was rubbing through. That nub is actually a rib that's on the back side of the original timing chain guide, that it's worn through the front face of this plastic so much that it's actually starting to expose that nub on the other side. And you can see how thin that timing chain guide is through that area compared to the new one. So it was well past due for replacement on this vehicle. What I did want to point out to you guys is I got this timing chain set. I ordered this online. I don't remember where I got it from. Oh yes, URO Tuning. It appears as though they ordered it from Worldpack and then sent it to me. But this is going to be your part number for that whole set. And that set includes the timing chain guides left and right, the new timing chain, a new upper guide, which is the guide that I actually originally found was broken, and then a new tensioner bolt. Now, one thing that I did notice while I was in here looking at things and just checking things out after I got it all torn apart is if you look down in there, I don't know if you're going to be able to see this really well, but there is a ton of slack in my oil pump drive chain. And there is no guide for that chain on this motor. I looked at the parts catalog and the parts like exploded diagrams, and there is no guide. It literally is just supposed to free float in there. But there is so much slack in there that can almost make it jump a tooth just as it's sitting right now. So that's a little bit worrisome to me. So I'm gonna end up getting a timing chain, or sorry, an oil pump chain and sprocket kit. I'm gonna get one ordered and get that replaced before I finish this whole job out. Once I get that all replaced, we're going to go back with putting everything back together, and I'll show you guys how to put the whole timing chain cassette back down in there, get it all set up, get the sprockets put back on, get everything tightened down, you know, tell you torque specs and everything, and then I'll show you everyone how to rotate the motor over and then recheck to make sure that it's still in time properly and that everything was done right. So I'm going to get that oil pump chain and sprocket and all that ordered. We'll get that thrown in, and then we'll get our timing stuff thrown back in. So this is to be finished in the future. All right, so it is now the future. I ordered a new oil pump chain and gear set. It came with the new gear down here that's driven off the oil pump, a new bolt for that gear, the new gear up here at the crankshaft, and a new timing chain, or sorry, oil pump chain. So before, I had so much slack in this chain right here that I could actually almost push it down and make it jump a tooth, and now I have almost no play. There's play in there, obviously. It's not going to be perfect because there's no tension or anything for this, but it is not going to run the risk of jumping off of a tooth and or coming apart just due to age and wear. So I recommend, if you are going into your vehicle to do a timing chain replacement, that you, prior to starting on this job, plan on doing the oil pump chain and gear set as well, because odds are if you have a worn timing chain and guide, you're going to have a worn oil pump chain and components as well. So in order to get this off to the oil pump, I ended up having to put the upper engine mount arm and bracket back in to hold the motor in so that I could take my jack out of the way and pull my oil pan off. Oil pan just has a bunch of 8mm bolts holding it in. There are some that are above the exhaust that are a little bit difficult to get to, but you know, capable of being removed without having to take the exhaust out. So pull the pan down, break our bolt loose for our oil pump gear here down here at the bottom. I had to put the hub back in up here at the crankshaft in order to hold the crankshaft from turning, or the actual oil pump gear and stuff from turning, because right now it free floats because there's nothing tensioning the gear on the crankshaft there. So I had to put the hub back in so I could counter hold that gear at the top so I could break the bolt loose on the oil pump. So everything's swapped out and new now. We're going to be going back together here. I'm going to put this timing chain cassette in without holding or supporting the motor, just to show you guys how it goes in and how to put it all down in there and get everything lined back up properly before you're going back together. And then I will get this oil pan thrown back on so that we can get our upper bracket up here pulled back off and get our top bolt in our guide, and then get all this stuff up here put back together. So I'm going to get this timing chain cassette assembly, which I showed you guys previously. It's supposed to look like this. It's supposed to be all one piece. Okay, I'm going to get this dropped down in the motor, get our hub put back in there, and get that torqued down to spec, and then we'll get started putting everything else back together. All right, so I went ahead and put my oil pan back on so that I could hang my motor or sit it on my jack again, my wooden block and jack, so that I could finish putting all the timing chain stuff on. So I just put the oil pan back up and put a couple bolts in it. I still have not tightened the bolt for the oil pump gear. I needed to put this hub back in so I could do it, and I figured I might as well, if I'm going to put the hub back in, make it be the last time I put it in, which recorded me putting all the timing chain stuff in. So put the pan back on, got the jack back up in place, got our timing chain cassette assembly put together the way I had showed you guys previously, dropped it down in there, put our hub back in here, put our center bolt back in. This is a new center bolt. And then after the center bolt goes in and you just kind of have everything held in place, I put these two guide pins up here that hold the timing chain guide down at the bottom here, ran those back in. I then put the top one back in as well. The top one gets torqued to 30 Newton meters. There's a crush washer on the back of that needs to be replaced, so you can use like an oil crush ring or a oil drain plug crush ring. And then these two down here get torqued to 24 Newton meters. I will throw up on the screen here with that as well, the foot-pounds amount for those. And then there's O-rings on these two down here. You need to make sure you replace those O-rings as well. Once I got that stuff all set down in place, set up, that meant that our timing chain guides are held in place and we don't have to worry about anything falling. While I was doing that, I had my chain held up in tension with like a bungee cord, just to make sure that my chain didn't fall down in between the two halves of the cassette and get, bound up on the gear down there at the crankshaft. So I then put camshaft sprocket on for the exhaust camshaft. This bolt gets torqued to 20 Newton meters and then gets torqued to a torque angle of 90 degrees. And then pulled tension on everything, made sure that there was no slack in this slack side of this chain down here on the exhaust side. Put the intake camshaft sprocket back on. This gets torqued to 20 Newton meters and then gets torqued to a torque angle or rotation of 180 degrees as well. Again, I will throw the foot-pounds measurements up there in case you guys are using some of the more available store-bought torque wrenches that don't have Newton meters adjustments on them. So now we've got this all put in place, everything's torqued up. Our crank pin is still in place in the flywheel holding our crankshaft in time, and we still have our timing components up here holding our camshafts in time. Now I'm going to put the special tool out of our timing set in place of our tensioner, and then once you get it bottomed out all the way, there is a pin here in the middle that screws in to the and tensions the timing chain guide. That just kind of gets tensioned to like finger tight. It doesn't have to be super tight. Just run it in until it is like this. The spec is 0.6 Newton meters. That's almost impossible to do with tools. It's more or less just kind of hand tight. So I ran this in hand tight to where I have tension on the chain and everything like that. There's no slack and everything. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull all of my timing tools off at the top, and I'm going to pull my pin out at the crankshaft in the bottom. I'm going to roll the engine over one full rotation. I'm going to put my crank pin back in place, and then I'm going to come up here and make sure that my timing tools fit. And if my timing tools fit up here while my crankshaft pin is in place, then that means everything's still in time and we've done our